Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Whistleblower Diaries. I'm Nevena, General Manager of the Information Rights Project, and wherever you are tonight, thank you so much for joining us. This is now the fifth instalment of this series. Whistleblower Diaries puts you in direct conversation with people who have paid a price for telling the truth. Our previous guests, if you have been along for the ride with us, include CIA whistleblower John Kiriakou, Chris Hedges and Hussein Dogru, Anthony Lowenstein, and last month we welcomed Bernard Collaery. But tonight we are joined by Andrew Wilkie, the independent member for Clark. I'm sure he's known to many of you tonight, but for those who might be hearing this story for the first time or are new to it, on 11th of March 2003, Andrew Wilkie resigned as a senior analyst of the Office of National Assessments and told the country the government's case for the Iraq War was built on distorted intelligence. He was the only serving intelligence official in Australia, the United Kingdom, or indeed the United States to resign publicly before the invasion. And of course, now we know in clear light that no weapons of mass destruction were found. Interestingly, he also ran against former Prime Minister John Howard in Bennelong in 2004 and wrote about the experience in the book Axis of Deceit. He was elected to federal parliament in 2010 and has held the seat ever since, now as the member for Clark. Previously, he's also served in the Australian Army, rising to Lieutenant Colonel. Since entering Parliament, he has pushed repeatedly for stronger whistleblower protection, including the Whistleblower Protection Authority Bill he co-sponsored. The timing tonight matters and is crucial. David McBride becomes eligible for parole on the 13th of August. That's just 9 days from now. We are so thankful to be in conversation with Andrew tonight, so we'll be there till about 7:15 and then we'll turn to your questions. We welcome you to write your questions in the Q&A function or also in the comments. But here we go. Andrew, welcome to the Whistleblower Diaries.
G'day, Nevena. Nice to be on the podcast.
Now, let's start with the most important thing first. How is Tasmania's biggest name, Neil the Seal, doing?
Biggest name what?
The biggest name, Neil the Seal. How's he going?
Oh, well, there's been a bit of a scandal revealed yesterday or today that someone was trying to flog off Neil the Seal gear, hoodies and things, and claiming they were going to give the proceeds to various environmental groups in the state. But I think it's a bit of a scam.
Oh, no.
But at last report, Neil has headed off, and I suppose we'll see him next season.
I heard he also had quite the bill of destruction, about $31,000 in his
Yeah,
way.
over $30,000 of damage. He tried to shed his they call it skin or fur or whatever, his coat, I think that's the word, by rubbing up against everything he could find, everything from road signs through to petrol bowsers. And the funny thing is, he's only a fraction of his adult size. So I don't know what's going to happen in the next few years.
Well, we might need a bigger Tasmania next time he comes back. Andrew, take us back to March 2003. You were inside the Office for National Assessments reading the intelligence on Iraq. What was the moment you knew that you had to walk out the door?
Yeah, just to explain, it was called the Office of National Assessments back then. It's now been renamed the Office of National Intelligence. It's one of 6 Australian intelligence agencies. It is actually the senior intelligence agency, and the Director General of ONI is effectively the senior spook who coordinates the efforts of the other 5 intelligence agencies. I was working as a senior analyst, and at some point during 2002, I was tasked to start focusing on Iraq, because as an ex-Army Lieutenant Colonel, I would have been working in the National Intelligence Watch Office once the war broke out. In the lead up to the war, though, apart from keeping an eye on the issue generally, I was also asked to look at the humanitarian aspects of it. And in fact, I wrote the report for the Australian government for the Prime Minister in late 2002, which explored the possible humanitarian consequences of a war. that really sharpened my focus. It's one thing to look at the warfighting side of it and how will that play out. It was another thing entirely to look at the possible humanitarian consequences. I laid out a number of possible consequences from the unlikely through to the inevitable. And I tell you what, that was a very sobering exercise. It really made you think long and hard about the implications of a war and, was it the right thing to do? Because as it turned out, it was a humanitarian disaster. So, and because I wasn't a professional intelligence officer, I was actually an ex-infantry officer. I think I also came to it with a very sort of a fresh take on the whole situation, which helps to explain why I was probably more critical than other people in my assessment. And it became increasingly. Sorry, this is a long-winded answer,
Please go.
but it slowly became clear to me that not only was this a really risky endeavour that would probably be a humanitarian disaster, it also became clear to me that the official case for war was fraudulent. For those who were around at the time, they'd recall that it was the official case for war being peddled by the Australian government, the US government, the British government, was that Iraq had a massive arsenal of weapons of mass destruction, that it was cooperating actively with the Al-Qaeda terrorist network led by Osama bin Laden. It was only a matter of time before these weapons of mass destruction were in the hands of terrorists. And the British were saying, within a matter of 40 minutes, there could be a missile landing on British soil with weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, biological weapons. It became clear to me that was just nonsense. And then it moved from being an issue of an intelligence assessment. It became an issue of where was the line in the sand for me that I could no longer support the move to war. And more importantly, equally importantly, where was the line in the sand where I should stop supporting the government and start speaking out? And I don't know where it was. Well, I know it was in February because I told someone, one of my work colleagues. I said, "Look, I'm going to resign and speak out." That was in February. I was overseas on a trip. I think I was actually in Colombo in Sri Lanka at the time, where I finally decided, when I get back to Australia, I'll start the process of preparing to blow the whistle on the whole thing.
Now, this is going to be slightly long-winded, but I'm part of an Ozpol book club, and we're currently reading Lazarus Rising for anyone who hasn't had it before. It's a 700-odd page book written by former Prime Minister John Howard, and there's an entire chapter on Iraq. And he says, in all my speeches, I placed heavy reliance on intelligent assessments that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction capacity, and that capacity was at the heart of our case for military action. I was determined that the intelligence case presented was concise, factual, and unemotional. What does that say to you about how Howard sold the Iraq War to the Australian people?
That explanation is nonsense, because there was always uncertainty in the intelligence assessments provided to the government. Now, I'll give John Howard, I'll cut him a bit of slack here. His main source of advice was from the Office of National Assessments. And I criticise O&A that O&A did at some point start to harden up their assessments and take the ambiguity out of it, but only to a degree. It was always the case that the assessments contain words like could rather than do. And there were some of the other five intelligence agencies had a much more sceptical take on the situation. I'll give credit to the Defence Intelligence Organisation at the time, which always had doubt in its assessments, which were going up through the Defence Minister to the National Security Committee and the Prime Minister. Yes, O&A did start to become too customer focused, if I could use that term, and did start to say more of what the Prime Minister wanted to hear. But there was always doubt, and there was always good grounds for doubt. Remember, the head of the weapons inspectors at the time, the Australian Richard Butler, he'd been asking they hadn't found any weapons of mass destruction. He and the weapons inspectors were asking for more time. I mean, surely that alone was ringing an alarm bell that there is doubt here. You know, the weapons inspectors who had virtually unrestrained access to the length and breadth of Iraq to go and look for weapons of mass destruction, they couldn't find anything. I mean, that's pretty telling. Plus, in addition to the formal intelligence assessments that were being provided to government, there was a whole stream of other information that was coming through. For example, I can remember being in ONA at the time and looking over the shoulder of a colleague and reading a cable that was coming from the ONA liaison officer in Washington, who was teasing out what she thought was really going on and the real reasons for the war. I mean, all this information was coming in. And even if this answer is more long-winded than your question, even if the government was getting this case for war, it was also confronting an enormous public backlash. You'd recall in what it would have been probably February 2003, around the world, there were the biggest anti-war protests that have ever been seen. Millions of people were taking to the streets. Some of the biggest protests Australia has ever seen, up there with the anti-Vietnam War protests of the 60s, 70s. And the government was just dismissing that. I mean, they were heady days. And here am I, in my little cubicle in ONA, which is at the time was on the top floor of the ASIO building at Russell offices in Canberra. And I'm seeing these cables from the ONA LO, how's that for a set of acronyms? And I'm reading nonsense intelligence reports from Israeli intelligence who are egging the Americans on. I'm reading these intelligence assessments from the Defence Intelligence Organisation that are saying, whoa, you know, that the situation was ambiguous, and it was nothing like the unambiguous situation that was being described in the Australian Parliament and elsewhere by John Howard, by Alexander Downer, and by others. Everything was swirling around. I'm in the middle of this, thinking this is all nonsense. I've got to do something about it. So it helps to explain the. I got to say, when I decided to resign, I went out and I resigned. I went to the media and I called the Prime Minister a liar. I was so far out on a branch on my own, it wasn't funny. I'm glad I got it right.
You did. And with all of that, you've said that your case was the exception. Your claims were vindicated and you managed to build a career as an independent in Parliament. But then, so you've said you've gone out on that branch. Take us back to that time. What happened to you in the months after you went public? And after you called the Prime Minister a liar, you know, you've painted that picture. There are these enormous demonstrations, there's protests. It was a very heady time. But what was happening after you walked out?
Look, initially, my story is similar to probably a lot of whistleblowers. I resigned that afternoon knowing that if I didn't resign, I'd be sacked anyway. So I was instantly unemployed. I was loudly condemned by the government. I remember the day after I resigned, I was told by someone, I think in the press gallery in Canberra, that John Howard's chief of staff was working the press gallery, working the corridor and telling everyone that I was mentally unstable. The Director General of ONA did probably his first and only press conference that after the afternoon of my resignation, said I wasn't involved in the Iraq issue. I knew I had nothing to do with the Iraq issue. even though I was providing the government with the assessments on the humanitarian consequences, and I was actually tasked to be ready to work in the National Intelligence Watch Office, effectively as a military strategic analyst because of my background. Uh, so there was that. I don't know if it's a government response. I think it might be an organisational response to a whistleblower.
Mm,
Discredit them. They're disgruntled. They don't know what they're talking about. They're not involved in the issue. Um, you can imagine the checklist they work through, and it's typical probably of a lot of organisations, not just the government, the Australian government at that time. Uh, but I was actually very lucky. This was a different time. It's not like recent days where, say, the tax office whistleblower Richard Boyle is charged, or David McBride goes to jail.
mm,
Uh, 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 Bernard Cleary, witness K, the organisational response when they spoke out over the illegal bugging of the East Timorese Parliament building. I think I think I was a little ahead of the curve, and I benefited from that. I don't know that if the government knew what to do about me. Plus, by accident, believe me, I'm not that smart. It wasn't a grand plan I was playing out. It was a bloke who just resigned and said the Prime Minister's a liar, and we'll see what happens from here. But as it turned out, I I I enjoyed enormous public support and media interest, and that served to sort of sandbag my position to some degree. Like by the day after and the day after that, I had such a high public profile. Um, it would have been entirely counterproductive for the government to charge me under the Crimes Act and try and throw me in jail. I would have been so obviously a political prisoner.
mm,
That's very different to the situation these days. Plus, when I say I'm a very lucky person, it was a huge issue. I got it right. Um, I don't like to use the word vindicate. That sounds arrogant, but I got it pretty right. Not entirely. There were a few little errors, but I got it pretty right. Uh, and I became politically active, and I was elected to federal parliament in 2010. I've been there for 16 years. I'm a really lucky man. The average whistleblower in Australia gets little or no media attention. Uh, if they get some media interest, the caravan moves on after a day or two. I mean, every day in Australia, people are speaking up about misconduct, whether it be in their business or the local council or whatever. I mean, every day, probably over a year, there's hundreds, thousands of people who speak up, and no one cares that much, but they still lose their job.
mm.
Um, it still places enormous pressure on them and their family. Uh, I'm one in a million that I ended up in federal parliament. Uh, so I worry about all the rest.
Mm.
I mean, take Julian Assange.
Yeah,
Uh, he went through a shocking, how many years that was.
14 years.
Yeah, Belmarsh High Security Prison, you know, sharing a prison with terrorists and murderers and who knows what. But at least he got widespread public support, and it generated a campaign that ultimately resulted in him being freed
Mm,
and being able to rejoin his wife and children in Australia. But as shocking as Julian's story is, uh, as as good as my outcome was, we're two in a million.
yeah.
Australia is a really tough place to blow the whistle.
And so, just on that, we've described, and you've described very clearly the big gap is not just the protections on paper, but also what happens to whistleblowers each and every day. And we've got the contrast between what happened to yourself, what happened to Julian, and say what's happening with whistleblowers today, 20 years apart. What do you think has changed and what do you think will always be true of the whistleblowing process?
Well, I'd love that question. One of the problems in this country, I think, has been cultural. I think whistleblowers we haven't been celebrated.
Mm.
Um, I can't remember what year it was. Was it? It might have been 2002, I think it was. The Time Magazine Person of the Year was actually three whistleblowers in the United States.
Wow.
I can't remember the details. I think one was from Enron. No, I can't remember. One was an FBI whistleblower, I think, over 2001. Anyway, it was three women on the front page of Time Magazine, and that was over 20 years ago. Well, I don't think Australia is up for that even now in 2026. In places like the UK, Western Europe, North America, whistleblowers have long been seen as an important part of the system. And I think we're still struggling to achieve that in Australia, although I think we've got better.
Mm.
Uh, I think, when I spoke up, I was criticised for all sorts of things. I was a tall poppy. I was not a team player. Some former colleagues, I remember, called me a traitor. Uh, I think it was almost a cultural response. You'd think for a nation of convicts, we'd be happy with troublemakers. But I've been thinking about this. I might have read this somewhere. I think because we're a nation of convicts, we relied on the soldiers to give us our daily food ration,
Yes.
our tea and our flour and our salt and our clothing. So maybe we haven't broken out of that dependence on authority. I don't know. I'm getting all very sort of philosophical here, but I think we're getting better. I mean, you
Yeah.
look at the outpouring of support for Julian,
Yeah. For
Richard
David?
Boyle. I mentioned David McBride. There was I've forgotten a name. Oh God, this is rude. Who spoke out about Dr. Patel at the Bundaberg Hospital? Um, uh, there's been whistleblowers in recent years, I think, that have started to enjoy the gratitude of the community.
Yeah.
So things are changing. The other issue, of course, is our legislation is still weak.
Yes. I
I
wanted
mean,
to ask you about this. You have introduced whistleblower protection legislation repeatedly since 2010. We're not seeing much progress from any governments. Why do you think that is?
governments love secrecy. Governments hate troublemakers. Governments are dragged kicking and screaming to legislate to protect whistleblowers. It was as recently as 2000 and was it 13 that the Gillard government finally legislated the Public Interest Disclosure Act, providing some legislated protections for whistleblowers in the public sector. It was more recent than that Senator Rex Patrick, to his credit, um, ensured there were some modest changes to the Corporations Act for the private sector. I think all of the states and territories had whistleblower protection long before the federal government had whistleblower protection. And excuse me if I sound cynical, but I think the reluctance was that governments crave secrecy. Governments don't like whistleblowers. The government at the time loathed me. If the governments were celebrating whistleblowing, and by the way, before the Albanese government was elected in, was it 2022, they made much of the fact that they would strengthen whistleblower protections. But yet no substantive legislative changes occurred over 4 years. In fact, worse, whistleblowers have been persecuted. I mean, it's just bizarre. Let's take Richard Boyle, the tax office whistleblower from Adelaide.
Mm.
I know Richard. He's a good egg. He's a good bloke. So he's working for the tax office. He's witness to egregious misconduct. He speaks up. His concerns are entirely vindicated, but yet he's charged and taken and dragged to court by the tax office. I don't think he had a conviction recorded in the end,
No.
uh, but only by the skin of his teeth. And in fact, he's an interesting case study in the problems with our whistleblower legislation. It seems to be the case that the court agreed that his act of whistleblowing about the tax office was protected, but the act of him collecting the evidence of the misconduct beforehand was found not to be protected by the Public Interest Disclosure Act. I mean, how crazy is that?
Absolutely
Never got
bizarre.
David McBride in prison in the ACT. Uh, I know the David McBride case has more layers to this. It's a complex case, but when you boil it down, the information he provided to the media, I think it was the ABC, did help to reveal alleged war crimes in Afghanistan. And David's in jail. I mean, this wouldn't happen in a country where the federal government genuinely celebrates whistleblowers.
That's right. And we've just got David Forbes has said Tony Hoffman spoke out against
Ah,
Dr. Death.
yes. Yes, Tony Hoffman.
Mm.
So she was a nurse at Bundaberg Hospital, and she blew the whistle on Dr. I think it was Patel,
Mm.
who stands accused of the death of many patients. And if Tony hadn't spoken up, uh, it never would have been revealed. I mean, she's a real hero. Um, our recent history has a string of people like this.
Even from the perspective of the Information Rights Project, we're working with a whistleblower named Marcus. So he was undercover working with ASIO as an agent for over 6 years, embedded in Western Sydney, posing as an undercover imam. He provided intelligence that led to convictions in Australia and overseas. His relationship with ASIO broke down. He had to flee to a safe country, and he decided to take the enormously courageous step of blowing the whistle and coming forth. He did an episode with Four Corners that alleged that there were serious intelligence failings ahead of the Bondi massacre because he was quite close with alleged shooter Naveed Akrim. And so the playbook came out again, Andrew. He was called disgruntled. ASIO took the enormous step of issuing a press release before the ABC episode Four Corners aired. In every article, it's quoted that he, is still a disgruntled person. What does that mean that even today, that same storybook is played over and over again for a prominent whistleblower who wants to testify at the Royal Commission, but currently can't get a visa back to Australia?
Yeah, look, I don't understand what's going on there. I do though see more or smell more than a whiff of typical organisational response, institutional response. It does. Look, I don't claim to know if Marcus is, who he claims to be and has the access to the information that he says he does. But I would have thought the Royal Commission would be keen to hear his side of the story. I don't know why ASIO would act this way in response.
Mm.
Uh, I mean, surely, if nothing else, his evidence should be presented to the Royal Commission if we're fair income about ensuring the Royal Commission has access to all the information. I can't but help think again. There's this cultural pushback to people who are outside the system, who claim to have information and they speak up. I used that term before about we should celebrate our whistleblowers.
Mm.
Now, sure, some people who speak up might be making vexatious claims. Some might be after some sort of reward. I don't know. Some might be bonkers. But, but the fact is, most people who speak truth to power, there's nothing in it for them.
Yeah.
There's no financial rewards in Australia. I mean, you'd be aware in the United States, for example, there is a mechanism for where if a whistleblower speaks up and it saves, I think, the taxpayer a lot of money by shining a light on misconduct or corruption, there's a mechanism there for that whistleblower to get a modest financial uh, reward.
Mm.
Uh, and apparently that system works quite well. It's an incentive for people to speak up because they know they're not going to be destitute and lose their house after the fact if they're making a fair income claim that's not nonsense or vexatious. But in Australia, there's no system like that. So in Australia, I mean, this is one of the things we've been pushing. We independents in the Senate and the House of Representatives have been pushing for some sort of uh, organisation that a whistleblower can go to and can get advice. Because let's face it, most whistleblowers aren't senior legal professionals. I had not the slightest idea what laws I might have been breaking in 2003. I was clueless. Most whistleblowers in Australia are clueless when it comes to what are the laws, what do they need to comply with, what are the laws that might protect them. We need some sort of independent whistleblower authority like they have in other countries, particularly in Western Europe, where a whistleblower can go to this organisation and get advice and be someone to like literally hold their hand legally through the legal process. So you don't do what Richard Boyle did, where he blew the whistle. Uh, Strictly speaking, it was protected by the Public Interest Disclosure Act, except the act of collecting information beforehand wasn't protected. Hence, he was hauled before a court. If he had some sort of whistleblower protection authority to go to get advice first, he wouldn't have made that what might be called a misstep. Um, so, if we had better laws, if we had organisations to protect whistleblowers, oh, there's my phone. Hang on, it's one of my daughters calling. I lost my train of thought. Um, where were we going with this?
All right. Well, I might take us in a slightly different direction. So we've spoken about the systemic issues, the cultural issues with whistleblowing as well. I also just want to have a brief discussion about the National Anti-Corruption Commission, because
Ah,
that was really supposed to change the integrity landscape. You've called its influence, let's be honest here, disappointing. What would it take for the NACC to matter?
oh, heaps of things. I think it has been disappointing. I think the fact that there were question marks raised over the head, and he's now departed. Now I don't know where the truth lies in that. I'm not making any allegation against Mr. Brereton, but God, if there's one public official in the country who shouldn't have questions being raised about them, surely it's the head of the National Anti-Corruption Commission. Uh, and then there were episodes along the way where people felt the NAC hadn't acted in the public interest. For example, not holding people to account over robo debt. I think it's had a very rocky start, uh, and I think the federal government needs to move promptly to remedy that, because we need to have confidence in the National Anti-Corruption Commission. Even if our country is clean and we don't have corruption, we need to be confident we have a tough cop on the beat. That we could have more confidence in our integrity organisation. By the way, this is only one of many things. I could go on all night about things about integrity. We need media freedom laws. We need all of our regulatory and law enforcement integrity bodies to be stronger, better resourced, better legislation around them, whether it be the ACCC or whatever. Some of the specific things I would do. Well, one of the first thing I would do with the National Anti-Corruption Commission would be not to mirror the New South Wales ICAC, because I think people would agree New South Wales ICAC is not perfect. Some people criticise it for being a bit of a star chamber where any allegation can be made publicly. But I think the ICAC, New South Wales ICAC, is a better model generally than the the NAC federally. For a start, they have public hearings.
Yeah.
I think that would be a positive step forward. There is a danger in having half-baked laws, half-baked whistleblower laws, and half-baked integrity agencies, because it allows governments to say the job is done and there's nothing to see here and we can move on. That can sometimes be uh, more problematic than having no whistleblower laws and having no integrity agencies, because the job's not even started and you keep championing to make things better.
I mean,
So
one example of those here in Victoria, we have IBAC, and that is where police officers and citizens can make allegations against police. But the issue with this, the way the IBAC is structured, is that 95% plus are investigated by police. So if, a police officer whistleblows or dobs in a colleague who hasn't done the right thing, it then can be investigated by other police. And we're not seeing a true measure of integrity when an agency is set up with such a shortcoming in its own structure. I mean, it's just laughable.
shortcomings by design, not by
Yes.
accident. Look, I've lived in Victoria in a previous life for a couple of years. It's a lovely place, but I tell you what, governance is pretty dodgy down there.
Yeah. There's a
Uh,
reason we're in the mess we're in.
I mean, some people would say Victoria is the most corrupt state in the country. I mean, if we do see a royal commission into the building industry, that might be helpful. IBAC desperately needs to be strengthened.
That's right.
I think IBAC is one of the weakest integrity agencies in the country. That's not
Completely
a
agree.
comment about the people who work there. They're just working with the laws, the legislation they've been given. But it ain't a New South Wales ICAC.
It certainly isn't. Andrew, I'm going to ask you one more question. We have many comments and questions to get through, but if you do have a question or comment, please feel free to use the Q&A chat or the comment section. Andrew, magic wand, you wake up tomorrow and you are Prime Minister of Australia with a supermajority in the House and the Senate. What would be the top three things that you do to strengthen integrity, whistleblower legislation, and accountability?
Oh, heavens, that's a big question off the cuff. You should have given me notice of that. The three things. Okay. Uh, Off the cuff. I would do a root and branch reform of all whistleblower legislation at the federal level. Obviously, the Public Interest Disclosure Act for the public sector, obviously the relevant section of the Corporations Act for the private sector. But there's also whistleblower protections are also contained in, I think off the top of my head, something like 7 other areas of federal law, for example, the tax laws. So a deep dive to genuinely protect whistleblowers. That would include, by the way, a whistleblower protection authority, not the sort of ombudsman the Attorney General is talking about at the moment, which is a bit half-baked. So I would protect whistleblowers properly. I would also legislate robust media freedom laws so that when a whistleblower sees misconduct and speaks up, that the media can safely report the whistleblower's claims. Because take my case, if the media hadn't made a big song and dance about me, there's a much greater chance I would have ended up in prison for several years under the Crimes Act. Publicity and profile protects whistleblowers, helps protect whistleblowers. I would then do a really thorough review of all of our regulatory, our law enforcement, and our integrity agencies. Obviously, starting with the NAC, but also the federal police, other federal law enforcement agencies, because ultimately what you need, it's a continuum. You
Mm.
need people to risk all and speak up. You need the media to publicise it, and you need these government agencies to do something about it. And unless you have that continuum reliably, then it doesn't work.
Yeah.
Um, so there you go. Off the top of my head, there's those three things.
Well, it sounds like you're going to have a very busy period in your time as Prime Minister. We're going to jump to some questions and comments now. We have a comment from Will who said, I visited David McBride recently in Canberra and he's doing well. Thanks very much for the update, Will. We have a question from Kirsten who asks, Andrew, did you ever receive an apology from anyone in government or Office of Assessment for your speaking up in truth against their wishes?
No. And in fact, when I fronted a parliamentary inquiry some months later, it was the parliamentary committee overseeing some of the intelligence agencies, when I thought they would ask me, okay, well, how did you come to these conclusions? What made you different? What can we learn from that? Instead, it was a hatchet job to destroy my reputation. So too, when I went to the UK at the request of a British parliamentary inquiry, rather than being asked, well, how did what can we learn from this? It was a hatchet job. I will share with you, I think, quite a lovely aside. Just a few months ago, I met with John Howard. I asked to meet with former Prime Minister John Howard to talk about gambling reform and for me to encourage him to get in the ear of the current Liberal Party leader about doing something about gambling harm. John Howard, to his credit, immediately accepted my request to meet with him. He gave me an hour in his office in Sydney, and we talked about it openly. Both sides of the barricades, we came together. I'm still cross with him, and I think he's still pretty pissed off with me. But I thought it was pretty grown up that we could finally talk about it. So,
And we won't ask you what happened within that hour, but did you have a sense of resolution when you left the office?
uh, look, it was nice from a personal point of view. It was nice that someone who I spent 23 years calling a war criminal and a liar, actually, we could have a cup of tea and talk about it. Um, uh, I think I ended the meeting with us both accepting that we both felt we did the right thing at the time. I still think it was one of the darkest chapters in Australian foreign and security policy. Uh, and I'll forever be dirty with his government for the decisions they made. But at least he was decent enough for us to have that. And by the way, he's totally on side on gambling reform, but it was sort of what brought us together. But it was a one of those sort of funny moments in one's life.
I can imagine so. We have a question from an anonymous user asks, what value did the Pentagon and other governments put on Hans Blix's inspections of nuclear facilities?
I don't think the Pentagon or the White House uh, were interested in what the weapons inspectors had to say. Remember the war in Iraq. Well, it's. Let me go back a way. Before the invasion, we had the US. This is going to test my memory now. We had the US midterm congressional elections the year before, 2002, and the Republicans in the lead up to the US midterm elections really played up the threat from Iraq. They made the 2002 congressional midterm elections very much a national security election, and they really uh, over-egged the threat from Iran. That was when there was all this talk about, all these aluminium tubes and um, I think Iran was buying uranium from Niger, and there was a whole story unfolded through 2002 to help the Republicans do well at the congressional midterm elections. And they did. From memory, the Republicans did very well in 2002. But they'd put the country on a course to war, which actually had very little, if almost nothing, to do with the facts on the ground. The fact that the weapons inspectors hadn't found had found nothing. It was clear that the Iraqi, I should say, nuclear program had been basically shut down. They couldn't find any evidence of chemical or biological weapons production. But by this stage, the US was almost on an inevitable course to war. It probably suited them that the weapons inspectors had pulled out. People say, "Oh, did it really matter what Australia thought or was saying? Did it actually matter at all what I was saying?" On one level, it didn't, because the US was committed to doing Iraq. They'd run out of targets in Afghanistan. They needed the next national security crisis for domestic political purposes. I don't know if that answers the question, but and it's a pretty grim assessment on my part. But by late 2002, I don't think anyone could have stopped the war. It didn't matter what Hans Blinks had to say.
Yeah, and I think any amount of reading when you do retrospectively, you can see that all roads led to Iraq. We have a question from Wafa who says, "Excuse my ignorance, has Andrew written a book that we can read as well?" Here we go.
Oh,
Bit of
well,
a plug.
I'm going to give it a plug.
Yes.
I did write a book in 2000 when did it come out? 2004. Be out of print now. It's not a very good book. I wrote it in a bit of a hurry. I'm not a particularly good writer, but I did feel it was important to put my position on the record. So what's it called? Axis of Deceit.
That's the one.
Axis of Deceit. Which I think it holds up pretty well, because it's only a little bit more than a pamphlet, but it sort of lays out the facts, almost like an intelligence assessment. This is what was said. This is what was found. This is why they did it. I think it's an important record.
We have an anonymous question. How does one get help after making a disclosure? I presume that they mean a
How does
whistleblower
someone get
disclosure.
help? Okay, now that's an important question. There is no at the I don't know about all the states and territories. At the federal level, there is no organisation you can go to. This is why David Pocock, Helen Haynes, Jackie Lambie, and myself have been pushing for some sort of independent whistleblower protection authority where you could go to and get advice, even get legal advice and be guided through a process. At the moment, whistleblowers in Australia are pretty much, at the federal level, are on their lonesome. There are now what's it called? The Human Rights Law Centre runs
Yes, the Whistleblower Project.
the Whistleblower Project. Oh, I'm glad you probably know more about this than me. So the Human Rights Law Centre in Sydney, have I got that right?
Yeah.
And Kieran Pendra is, I think, central to that. They will give people some advice if you go to them, the Whistleblower Project. My staff are going to hate me saying this. You can get in touch with people like me, and I can't give legal advice, but I can tell people what I think about what they've got to say. But what I will say to anyone who's contemplating being a whistleblower, be cautious. Don't do anything unless you're absolutely certain of what you think. And to be very careful to comply with the relevant laws. Every state and territory has whistleblower protections for the public sector. The federal government has protection for the public sector, but it is deeply flawed. Can I just make this point to that? The Albanese government was elected 4 years ago over 4 years ago with a commitment to do a really deep and effective reform of all our federal whistleblower legislation. It has done consultation on the Public Interest Disclosure Act, which is flawed, or the Act is flawed, and it has sat on the results of that consultation and done nothing. It's currently doing a review into the relevant parts of the Corporations Act, but it's just a review. It's made an announcement of a whistleblower ombudsman and has done nothing about it. That's a caution to anyone who's listening in tonight. The laws are weak, but there are some protections that people have got to be really careful to comply with that.
I've got many comments here thanking you for speaking out, thanking you for your integrity. Joanne says, Andrew, if we had more people like you in Australia, what a different political and cultural system we'd have. Thank you for that comment. We've got time for perhaps one more, and I might just do this comment first from Paige. She says, as a whistleblower of sorts in the entertainment industry, I feel like the pattern of corruption repeats across the board because it's trickling down. Does that resonate with you, Andrew?
That corruption is trickling down. Look, I wasn't going to mention this, but I will. I've wrestled with whether or not to make a referral to the National Anti-Corruption Commission about the effect on the federal government of gifts and donations and hospitality extended by the gambling industry to the federal government, and the degree to which that has resulted in the federal government with gambling refusing to bring down effective reforms and, in fact, acting completely at odds with the public interest. And I've been wrestling with going to the NAC about this, because at what point, so I'm getting to a punchline here, at what point does political donations and hospitality become corruption? And I think this is an example of trickle down, arguably corruption. You know, when our nation's leaders are acting so improperly, what example does that set? What hope do we have that our kids at school or our local government or our small businesses are acting properly? Australia is. I love my country. I'm proud of my country. I don't want to live in any other country, but we're not clean. It's just that in Australia, money changes hands and things are accepted because they're within our legal framework. But I don't know that they're any better than a brown paper bag in another country.
Here. And on that sobering note, we might wrap up here. Andrew, on behalf of the Information Rights Project and the many hundreds of people who've joining us tonight, thank you for your work and your unflinching dedication to integrity. Thank you for sharing your experiences with us and your time. As a federal parliamentarian, finding an hour in the calendar is very difficult. So we really appreciate you being on the Whistleblower Diaries with us and wish you a lovely evening.
And thank you. I've enjoyed it. It's been fun.
Thanks so much. Good night, everyone, and good night to you, Andrew.